What I want to look at is one of the really interesting frameworks which is going to help you to understand the relationship between the three modules you're doing this semester. Because you're doing IT services management, IT product development and databases, aren't you?
Product design.
Oh, product design, yeah. So enterprise architecture is going to show you how those three areas connect together across the entire spectrum of activity to satisfy organizations. So what I want to do is basically outline briefly what we're going to achieve, which is how do those business needs which we talked about last week and you were researching last week, and the real question was, can IT add value to a business? And I guess you got a fairly mixed picture from the research you did. Yeah. It can, but it often doesn't. And so this has been a perennial problem, as we've discovered. And a guy called Zachman created a really interesting way of understanding how you connect from the very top of that, the organizational structure, the sort of corporate strategic direction, all the way down through essentially the requirement specification process, through to the design and build, and all the technologies underneath that is part of the whole field of information technology. Do you mind if I switch the light out, by the way, folks, so you can probably see better? And so Zachman created his architecture, which has also been implemented into an open source procedure called TOGAF. And we start off ultimately at the very, very highest level with a vision. This is what we're going to do. This is what we need. This is what the service is, and how we're going to actually deliver something that really, really works at a good price, that is technologically sound, and actually works for everybody who is using it, including the senior management who sponsored it, the people who are using it, and the customers who are ultimately outside the organization, the customers, suppliers, and other sorts of stakeholders get involved in getting value out of this. And we actually use 6 questions. And we'll see what those questions are very, very shortly. And as I keep coming back to frameworks, although some people just use them as a recipe, tick, 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 follow the recipe, and you should get a reasonable sort of result. As we all know, if you get a Delia Smith recipe and you see the photo that looks utterly fantastic, say the Delia Smith chocolate fudge cake, looks absolutely enticing. Now, when we make it, following that recipe very carefully, does it look like that? No, it kind of looks kind of a mess. It might be a bit thinner or something. But I want to look at it from a different perspective. I keep mentioning, these frameworks are not recipes, they are sets of really valuable questions that help us to work out what we need to do in the current circumstances. Now let's start about thinking at the very sort of beginning. If you think about some of the classic definitions of architecture, it's about the way that things relate to each other in terms of the hardware or the software, the computing bit. To run SAS Visual Analytics, we need a seriously overpowered server with huge amounts of memory and some very, very high-speed connections to a disk. And we need some software. Classic IT, classic computer science, looks at just the hardware, just the software. However, this is where Zachman really pays off. He says an architecture is a logical structure for classifying and organizing those elements of an enterprise, the whole organization, including the people, the processes, the procedures, the working practices, the technology, the screens and the tablets and servers, the networks, the switches, the whole thing. Those elements of an enterprise that are of significance to both the management of the enterprise and the way that those information systems actually get developed. Now, if I go back to the beginning of my career, it was fairly simple. You wanted a system that did something, it was going to be batch operated because we only had mainframes that ran batch systems. We hardly had any online terminal-based systems at all. So it was actually quite simple. However, what's happened since the early 70s is that organizations, enterprises have become more and more and more complicated and complex. The IT has become more and more complex, with more and more systems which are interconnected, with data that's updated at different times and different sequences and consolidated overnight, over the weekend, at the end of the month, at the end of the year, and. And so the complexity over the last 50 years has grown incredibly dramatically. We have the well-known problem that IT is not actually terribly successful. Standish Group reports, they're getting a little bit more successful over the last 20 odd years, but not as much as one would have hoped. IT, as people that I met out in Las Vegas last year and I will meet at the weekend, experts in the field of IT provision at all levels of complexity make the same comment. IT today, the IT systems, the software, the hardware, the connectivity is less reliable than it has ever been. Which is interesting because every other technology we know of has got more reliable, more effective over time. And IT doesn't do that, it would seem. So we need to find questions that help us to get answers as we develop these sort of things. Another aspect of a framework is that it provides a clear, structured way of thinking, this rigorous way of thinking. And another very, very important thing that comes out of the Zachman Framework is it helps to communicate, or that communication process between the people who want things, people who are using things, and the people who provide the things. Because, like in many fields, the experts who can create good IT do not necessarily talk the same sort of language or have the same sort of interest as the people who are running an organization. And I could go back to 1969 when I was working in one of in the computer center for about nearly 6 months. And most of the people there, the programmers, the systems analysts, the network specialists, they hardly knew what it was that we actually manufactured across the other side of the town. They hardly understood or recognized that we made jet engines. If we took them out of the computer center, that ivory tower, and put them into one of the workshops where the turbine blades or the discs that hold all the blades were being manufactured, and they stubbed their toe on this big round circular thing like that, they would be hard-pressed to realize or recognize what it was or how it related to their own life. And so there's an incredible barrier of communication, because the business side, on the other hand, yeah, they know about turbine discs, they know about customers and jet engines, and they know about flying and so on. But IT, bits and bytes and programs and computers and electronics, no, they're not interested in that. That wasn't something they can connect to. And we have this very, very curious problem that people who are trying to develop services need to be able to talk two languages: the language of business and the language of IT. And those who are successful at that interface between the techies who know bits and bytes and the business who know business, you have those sort of business analysts, the systems analysts, people in a sense like you're going to become, who can face both ways. Janus, the god who has two faces, but two faces in the sense of effective translators of jargon between the business jargon and the computing jargon, and the computing jargon and the business jargon. And so this framework that Zachman came up with helps to develop that clarity of communication. You see, business people will specify I want to be able to collect this amount of data, and I want to be able to analyze it like this so that I can make decisions like that. And they really do not want, nor should they. They do not need to understand the complexity. That's our job, to help translate that business picture into something that can be successfully implemented with who knows how much computational power, big networks, whatever. And so they are Janus who can talk both directions. Because what ends up is we get senior management are saying they want to run the organization. They want to be able, hand on heart, to know that they are meeting all of those governance requirements, that run the company effectively without cutting corners, without jeopardizing a company, such as happened with BP, such as happened with Tesco this year. So the framework helps to do that. It helps identify who has what responsibility in terms of operating and running and managing an organization, and who has the responsibilities to actually provide the technologies at what level. And with a bit of luck, it provides clear identification of all of the requirements. We don't forget parts of it. We don't forget some of those not intangible types of requirements, the non-functional requirements, like security, like speed of operation, and so on, which sometimes do get forgotten. And it provides a way of ensuring that the organisation can survive into the future and can be successful if we do it right. If we ask the right questions and get the right answers, then we can. But it can be very, very difficult, because I was talking to someone, a friend just recently, who's a very senior consultant in this sort of field. And she had got a kind of a document that is used within a particular organisation. And she had to talk, not to one or two people to find out what it was used for. She had to talk to 90 or 100 different people to get a full picture of how this collection of information or data was actually used, because they're doing some major work in rebuilding all of their systems, which links between the core of their business to their customers and their suppliers. And if you don't get that understanding right, and you've got to talk to 80 people or 90 people to find out what it's used for, that's kind of hard work. But that's what a good framework will lead you to do. So the first task I want you to do once we've finished this is to go find lots of resources that help you to understand what the Zachman Framework actually does, the Zachman Enterprise Architecture. Again, as always, build your working bibliography to Harvard standards as you go, and do that. And then, once you've done that, you'll begin to understand really what Zachman is all about. Got x-axis and y-axis. It's just a 2D thing. One axis, the x-axis, describes various parts of the organization. And the other axis provides you with a whole range of perspectives about the type of information, type of operation that's going on. And I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. Vertically, you start at the top level, which is the scope, the context, and is of relevance to people who are the architectural planners of an enterprise. Hence, context and planner. This is what the purpose of the organization is all about. This is where we're trying to get to. We're here, we need to develop and do the big things. The next level, called here the business model, is all about the concepts, not the context which links outwards. This is inside, the concept of what we're trying to do. And each area is owned by someone who's called the business owner. So you're really looking at the businesses that are going on within an organization. Then the level below that, you might call the logic, that's where you tend to fit in typically the high-level flowcharts. You get a designer, people who are, you know, the sort of things you might graduate to become a business systems analyst. The levels above are where you would hope to progress your career to over 5-10 years, to higher levels of the organisation, and ultimately, you know, when you're really experienced, you could become one of the architectural planners of a company. And we had Rolls-Royce when I left. Before I left, we had 3 or 4 guys who had enormous amounts of experience and understood how all of the systems kind of related to each other, not just at the techie bits and bytes level, but as business processes. And what we're really looking at, IT services management, is really looking at these top 2 with part of the system model level, some elements of design. Product development module tends to take a little bit of that one, part of that, and think about, you know, the interfaces, the things that Dennis is teaching you in product design. So we're now down at what sort of technologies are required, both in terms of software technologies, database technologies, network technologies, and sort of computing technologies, the boxes that do the computation. Whether it is cloud private, cloud public, or hybrid, or maybe not cloud at all. And then down at the bottom, this is where the real stuff gets done with your computer science colleagues who are programming, who are, if they're the computer science side, the programmers, if they're the network side, designing the details of where the boxes, the switches and the routers live, and how to flood wire here and connect to with all the right protocols. So computer science networks programs, they're operating down at this level. Product design kind of in these levels, and IT services management up in these sort of levels. And this should help you understand how to look at the type of service and fixing the problems in the service you're looking at in your assignment. So the direct connection from this framework with the work you're doing for your assignment, both in terms of choosing that student-related service that needs to be fixed or needs to be invented because it has these benefits which are very much the context and conceptual perspective on what's going on. And then across the top, Zachman split up the way that an organisation works into these 6 types of things. There's data, which is what we have. The function is how we manipulate it, what we do with the data. Networks, kind of where it lives. And then because all IT systems need to interact with humans, otherwise, at some level, otherwise what's the purpose? We need to understand the people dimension, the who. IT works, the way we manipulate and manage businesses is always time dependent. Often, what happens during the day, what happens at night time, what happens at the weekend, what happens at the month end, and so on. What are the sequencing issues? What's the, and how fast? And then the final bit is the why. Why are we doing this, the motivation? So there are 6 questions: what, how, where, who, when, why. And those 6 questions are the fundamental 6 questions that you can use in any situation to find out what's happening. Rudyard Kipling actually talked about those 6 questions in the late 19th century. And he put it roughly in the lines of, a good friend of mine taught me everything that I know. Or 6 good friends taught me everything that I know. Their names were what, how, where, who, when, why. And you know, it's really good to remember those, and that's why Zachman has picked them up to go along with the data, the function, network, people, time, and motivation. And although you probably can't see it very clearly here, but you'll be able to download a copy of that for yourselves. This is how he's actually laid it out. And you can see data, function, network, people, time, motivation, and then the 6 questions across across the top to see how it actually fits together. And then there's a very, very good book in the library, which you'll see in the last slide, which will tell you where a lot of the next material comes from. But do remember, IT services management is really these two rows plus a bit of that row. Product design is these two rows, and then computer science is these two rows, and down to the very bottom. And then you can go through each of those squares, and there's a slide here for pretty much most of those squares, or many of them. And you'll get the story behind each one that kind of illustrates how this actually provides us with an amazing way of understanding what's happening. And the first example in the book really comes from the Great Pyramid, which is what? 4,500 years ago. And it helps us to understand a bit about the context. Why did they build pyramids? Well, the why question is because they considered Pharaoh the god, therefore they needed to do various things. Helps us to understand 25,000 volunteers were involved in any particular pyramid, which leads to, in today's terminology, stunning human resource management issues, because you've got all sorts of people that you've got to feed, you've got to get them there at the beginning of the building season each year, and then get them home at the end of the building season so they could go and do their farming over the growing period. Vast amounts of activity. Now, they've got to pay them, they've got to build accommodation, they built some great villages and so on. And they did an astonishing job. You know, 4,500 years ago, they were actually not thick. They were actually just as bright as we are. And they had to coordinate the manufacture, transport and placing of 2.5 million 5 foot by 5 foot by 6 foot blocks of stone, which were carved and dug out of the rock faces miles away. So this gives you an amazing context of what was going on way, way back then. I mean, they couldn't have chosen a more inconvenient place. It was off the floodplain, up onto the plateau. It was desert. Stone quarries weren't there. You don't really want to build your accommodation on a dusty, sandy, hot desert, really. It's not a very good idea. The ports were miles away up on the river and up a long hill. So, giving you, from an aware perspective of the context, some really interesting challenges for them. But not only did they have 2.5 million granite blocks which are on the outside, they also had on the inside, they also had the facing stones, the limestone on the outside, 100,000. Another 25,000 alabaster ones to make it really smart looking, and unknown numbers of tools. So that's the what. Stunning amount of problems, but are you beginning to see how those questions are helping you to find what the problem is? What needs to be fixed, what needs to be sorted? And then the how. Well, these are sort of things that we would talk about today, and they had those types of things way, way back 4,500 years ago. They already knew all about production management in terms of designs, orders, sequencing of activity, and the real issue of program management. And we can see this happening all the way through time, whether we look at the building of the great cathedrals across Europe, whether we look at the Parthenon long time ago, whether we look at Rome when it was built in the Roman times. You know, all of those things have the same sorts of big contextual issues that need to be looked at. And that is the top level contextual side. For the building of the Great Pyramid, they had a remarkably tight timescale that they knew they had. So, like today, they had invented, effectively, program management and project management, and understanding from, if this is the date we have to get finished, how do we get everything done in time? How do we get the right number of resources to get the job done? And so on. And they worked out all of these things, including critical path analysis, 4,500 years, just by looking at the overall context of what they needed to achieve, something that had not been achieved before. And if you look at what come forward in time, 4,500 years to the Apollo project, and the Saturn project that put men on the ground, or on the moon, same sort of big question. Why are we going to do it? Well, it wasn't because JFK was a god or anything like that, but this was a challenge to kind of beat the Russians into space and then get to the moon first. And then the whole thing happened. All the main differences in terms of all of these 6 questions was that we had computers. So they could actually create PERT and CPA, critical path analysis software, that did it more easily than with large armies of people. And so overall, the context ultimately at that top level is about that. How do you get the right people in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons at the right cost? Because you cannot afford to bankrupt the country. If you come down a little bit lower to the owner perspective, because that's the other area that's important, and this becomes interesting and valuable in your assignment in the last section. How do you determine that your new IT service is actually successful? So you need to think about the owner perspective. And this just takes you through the 6 questions for how Coca-Cola was invented in 1886. Franchising, or in franchises, the when. They wanted, after the Vietnam, to develop new ways of doing things. The what had to do with trademarks and intellectual property. They did it with Coca-Cola by having a secret recipe, which even today, the actual recipe for Coca-Cola, the syrup that is sold to all the franchisees, is very, very tightly held. There are only a very small handful of people in the world who know what that real recipe is. It's incredibly tightly controlled. Just after Vietnam, they needed to change their strategy. That was the why, because PepsiCo was beginning to encroach on the Coca-Cola franchise, was taking market share away from them. And in terms of the who, the people involved, well, back in the post-Vietnam era, that's sort of the early 70s, globalization would begin to take off, so that Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola were not just an American, North American drink, it had gone worldwide. Every country in the world. When I was teaching down in Botswana, and Malawi, and Zimbabwe, and South Africa, in each country there's a franchisee who produces the Coke and bottles it and distributes the bottles out to their local shops who sell the stuff. It's global. Now we're down to the lower levels. Why do we design things? One of the most important questions, the important questions are here. These are sort of people we need to drive that why. In terms of the type of skills, we need leadership. We need good ideas that can manage things, who can actually get people fired up with that urgency. But you need truly to understand people. And as we look around us, whether it's our politicians or some of the senior management and some of the big organizations we see having troubles at the moment, it leads to a question, do they really, truly understand people? Something that, again, as you develop your careers, think always about people. Not the technology so much, but people and how they work, how they think, how they do things. Look at the way they do a job. Don't tell them a new way of doing it. Ask them how they would fix the problems they see around them. Because they will see problems all the time in the bureaucracy and the systems, and they will come up with really great ideas if you can use your understanding of people to fire them up to help you design their new system. And they love that. The most successful system I ever led the building of at Rolls-Royce in 1985, 86 or thereabouts. We just had one person working for me, a brilliant programmer analyst who understood people. He would go and sit with them day by day in the mornings, showing them, listening to them, finding out what they needed to do, what was the data that did it, how did they process it, how do they get it in, how do they need to get it out. Then he'd go away and do some work over during the afternoon, and he'd go back to them again in the morning. He would work with the most expert people in that particular part of the organisation. A year and a half later, we had a system that worked across the whole of the organisation, did exactly what they needed to manage all of their tasks, to design, develop, and eventually test, and then get into production and send out to our airline customers. We managed, with 18 months of work, to do that, and that project then lasted for the best part of 15 years, with almost nothing having to be changed. One of the most successful systems we had in the whole company did what the customer actually wanted. And then the other thing you have to think about is that balance in the how. How do we do it? Well, we have to balance our resources against that next level above, which is the design requirement. And then finally, and this is a module you'll come across in your third year, your final year here, is ethics and governance and leadership. And it's really, really rather important that we think about these two questions. And if you think about some of the big failures of companies, and we can ask of Tesco, we can ask it of BP, we can ask it of many, many big companies who've had big problems with governance. Often, we need to think about, if someone says, is it legal? They already know that quite possibly the approach is not very, really soundly based. If they ask, and this is a really interesting situation, how do I make this decision legal? Then they know already that they are in deep water, that they are actually asking for something illegal. And one of the interesting things was while I was doing my LLM back in 2002 and 3 or 4, I read quite a lot of the works of a guy called Ibrahim Shihata, who was the general counsel for the World Bank for about 10 years. And deep, deep, deep inside his writings, and he wrote a lot of papers about what he did in the World Bank, and they were in 2 great volumes about 4 or 5 inches thick, probably about 2,000 or 3,000 pages in each of those. And one of the things he said is that his executive directors of the World Bank never ever asked him, as a chief legal authority, the question of, right, here is a proposed course of action, could you provide us with your legal professional evaluation to see whether we should change our proposed direction and process to make it legal? No, not once. He was only ever asked by the executive vice presidents, this is what we've decided to do. Now, tell us how that fits in and it becomes a legal process. So they knew that what they were doing generally was not in line with the World Bank Charter, not in line with all sorts of other things. They wanted legal blessing for decisions they had already made, rather than dispassionate analysis of a proposed course of action that they could change, or they would change in the light of the advice. Now, what's very, very interesting is that many, many organizations still behave like that. They expect their accountants and their lawyers to find a way of blessing from an accountancy set of principles or from a legal set of principles a decision they've already made. They will not change it. And that gives some serious problems. And in O'Rourke's book, which is mentioned here, it's in the library, and you'll find the full reference at the back. She actually has quite a few examples of where this has gone wrong. And here's a fictitious one. You've got an oil shipping company who has got ships floating around the world, and they get oil in the bilges, which is the water that collects at the bottom of the boat. If they pump the bilges as they're supposed to do in port, say the cost is going to be 75,000 as US dollars as a charge for processing and separating the oil from the water and so on. But of course, if you do it at sea, the cost is zero because you just shut it out of the sea. If the law states you can only pump your bilges in the harbour, and if you're found doing it out at sea, then the penalty could be, say, $70,000. A lot of companies do, yeah. And if the risk of being caught is only 1 in 1,000, now it's kind of obvious. 1 in 1,000, you're going to get hit by $100,000, and the other 999 times you save $75,000. It's a no-brainer, in one sense. If you also have a set of organizational policies and bonuses, which, for example, here, what's the net profit of that ship's trip? Well, if I pump at sea, I have another $75,000 in the profit. If I pump in the port, I've lost $75,000. So my bonus is less. So you're actually encouraging the wrong sort of behavior. And there's another one a little bit like this. It's not quite so ethical, but it's again a kind of a problem of balancing behavior. Came out in the 1980s, and I think it was either DEC who had the problem. They wanted to develop a new way of, or better way of configuring their DEC fax MIDI computers. The problem they had was that they were the ultimate in the customer could configure exactly the system they wanted in terms of number of CPUs, the amount of memory, the number of power sources, the number and type of disks and so on. And because originally the salesmen were paid their bonus based on the price of the contract at the time the order was signed, there was no incentive for them to actually get the actual order perfectly accurate, that was actually buildable. So I got the order, I signed it, I got my bonus, and then it goes into production, and they come back and say, you need to go back to the customer and say, actually we need 6 more of these pieces of wire, these cables, we need 2 more cooling fans and so on. And the customer obviously got a bit hacked off, because the order value, which would be signed off at, say, $50,000, suddenly changes to $55,000, $60,000, $65,000, and they don't like that. They then built in the 85, 86, 87 with the first laptops a little system that was supposed to end up with a perfect configuration. And they thought they'd cracked the problem, but unfortunately, because they hadn't changed that bonus incentive system to a correct configuration as opposed to a configuration, they still had lots of problems. And the sales said, oh well, it's too difficult to use, so we can't use it, we won't use it, because we want our bonus paid immediately, our commissions. They then took it out, rebuilt it, an easier to use service, so IT service management principles make it work better. And then eventually they decided what the problem was. They were providing an incentive. The commission, which had been on the assigned order, then became changed to you will get paid your commission when that configuration of the order is correct. Might take you another week or two, another 3 or 4 weeks to get it sorted, but you only get your commission when it's a fully correctly configured order. And so if you get bonuses or commissions and so on aligned with inappropriate behaviour, the inappropriate behaviour will continue and you have an unethical situation. If you want it to work properly, an ethical environment, you have to make those bonuses, those incentives line up with the behaviour you want. And if you look at what's happened in the recent past, clearly that was not happening in the supermarket system. Clearly it wasn't necessarily happening in any of the big energy companies who've had lots and lots of their big environmental disasters, because the incentives didn't line up with the ethical governance perspective. And this is the book, which is a really brilliant book by Carol Rourke, Fishman and Selkoff, about how valuable the Zachman architecture is and how it has worked over the last 4,500 years to give you all sorts of amazing insights about how valuable those how, why, what, who, where, when questions are at whatever level, from the top level, that planner level, right down to the very bottom, highly techy bits and bytes side. And what you can use this for, and why I've said in the assignment, you will use the Zachman architecture as your governance framework, because it's got those something like 30 questions, or basically 5 sets of 6 questions, the who, how, what, where, why, when nature, that will help you to identify the governance approach, a really good way of ensuring your service that you are going to design, or you're going to identify how that's going to be valuable to your fellow students. Any questions? Okay, go back to through those pages to that task, the research into the enterprise architecture, particularly the Zachman Framework, and you could also look at TOGAF as well. Okay, go to that and then we'll talk about it later on.